to be visiting with someone, but then I don't have anybody. As everybody moves into Advent, it'll be less, right?
Right.
So, so it kind of ebbs and flows, and
Right. Sure. Sure. Um, well, we have been doing a lot of these, as you would imagine. This is
yeah,
a steady diet of Zoom Q&As, but they've really been wonderful. And so we've got Tina Clark, our director of Christian Formation, whom you know, of course, has almost everything transferred over to Zoom, which is really good. And then we have several in-person things as well, but everything online as in addition to that. So
yeah.
well, let's see. It's a minute after. I know people will join us here in a moment, but we will go ahead and begin. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm the Dean of St. John's Cathedral, and it's a joy to welcome all of you to this Dean's Forum. And our guest this morning is the Episcopal Church's staff officer for evangelism, a person with a big title, and we'll ask Jerusalem to explain that title in just a few moments. But Jerusalem Greer, welcome and good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad to have you. I've had the pleasure of watching a few presentations that you have done across the Episcopal Church, and I'm so glad that Tina Clark, our Director of Formation, was able to link up with you so that we can have you and talk about evangelism and Jesus and the sort of the culture of the church and perhaps a little bit about the future of the church. So we're really glad to have you. We'll talk about your title in a moment because I know people will be curious about that. And I'm curious about that. But before we do, I know that you are coming to us from Arkansas. Where are you these days?
I am home in Arkansas. I'm in central Arkansas. I'm about 45 minutes north of Little Rock. On the foothills of the Ozarks. So it's really beautiful where we live. And I live on a farm. We have an 8-acre hobby farm. We call it our hobby farm because it takes all our money. It doesn't give us any, right? And this morning, as you've probably already heard, some of our animals, our farm dogs and our chickens and our goats, everyone is very bright and cheery and vocal this morning. So you hear.
Yeah, arise and shine and give God the glory. So your companions are doing that. That's great.
Yeah, it's good. It's
so
good.
You said 8 acres, and tell me the animals that you have again really quickly.
Yeah, so we've got a ton of different kinds of chickens. We have pygmy goats, Nigerian dwarf goats, a pet pig who's about probably 200 pounds. He's a mini, which just means he's not like hog size. And then we've got cats and dogs, and wild bunnies and the usual assortment of wildlife.
Right, before we dive in, does the pig have a name?
Yes, the pig's name is Winston, like Winston Churchill.
Perfect.
Yes.
God bless Winston. Let's begin with a prayer, and then we'll dive in. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. This is a prayer for guidance from the prayers and thanksgivings at the back of the prayer book. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with your most gracious favor, and further us with your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally, by your mercy, obtain everlasting life through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Welcome everyone who's joining us. And I have several questions for Jerusalem that I will ask. So she and I will have a conversation. But if you think of a question that you would like to ask of Jerusalem or of me, if you'll go down to your navigation bar at the bottom of this Zoom meeting and just click Q&A, you can type in your question. We'll be sure to get to it. So again, Jerusalem, this title, Staff Officer for Evangelism. Tell us what is that, and what do you do?
Right. Yeah, that is such an interesting title. So many of our titles actually are just rooted in the beginnings of our church, which kind of came around the time of the Revolutionary War. So we have titles like Staff Officer, right? That sound very official. But really what that means is my primary role working with Canon Stephanie Spellers, who's the canon over evangelism, racial reconciliation, and creation care, um, is to oversee all evangelism work within the Episcopal Church. This is one of the presiding bishops. Those three areas are kind of his main kind of platform when he became presiding bishop. He felt like this is where God was leading our church, was to kind of dive deep into these three things, and along with General Convention, who agreed with that leading. And so my job is to oversee anything kind of related to evangelism
Mm,
work. And so everything from training to curriculum to resources, to doing things like this, to kind of looking to the future of where our church is going and what needs we might have around evangelism, and working with other departments within the church. I work a lot with all the other departments because every bit of our work has something evangelistic about it, even if we don't
sure,
necessarily think about it in those terms, because all evangelism is just the sharing of good news, right? And so if you think about racial reconciliation, that is good news. Creation care is good news. Our
sure.
ecumenical work is good news. And so so I do a lot of work around that, and then I just do a lot of work about helping to kind of dig in and dispel the myths of what evangelism is or isn't, based on other people's experiences, especially with other denominations, right? So we talk a lot about what specifically is Episcopal evangelism, which is actually rooted in, and not just Scripture and Jesus, which I mean that's number one, right? But also in our baptismal covenant, when we make the promise to proclaim the good news of God in Christ through word and action. I mean, that's a call to evangelism. So it really is part of our Episcopal identity, and I just kind of help shepherd the fleshing out of that. So
Wonderful. How long have you been in this position?
I guess I've been in this position of a full-time staff member about a year and a half. I worked as a consultant for a year previous, so I've kind of been working with the presiding bishop's team on this for about 2.5 years.
Oh, interesting. And is the position new to Bishop Curry's tenure?
This particular position is. There have been evangelism positions previously, with previous administrations, right? Because that's
Sure.
really how we're set up. But not in the last one or two. It just wasn't a current, I think, and I would totally get this wrong. Like you'd have to check with the archives, but I think the last official position was probably in the 90s. And so there hadn't been one in a while.
Well, I want to, before we shift to other questions, I want to just flag very quickly for people two people that you've mentioned. One, of course, is Michael Curry, the presiding bishop, and a lot of our people have heard Bishop Curry, some in person, a lot more online. We were very lucky to have Bishop Curry as our new bishops, or new-ish bishops, now new-ish bishops consecration, almost a couple of years ago now, or about a year and a half ago, actually. And if anyone who's listening has not heard Bishop Curry, it truly is more than worth it. And all you'd have to do is Google Bishop Curry sermon video, and you'll have plenty of choices. And of course, he famously is the preacher from the royal wedding. Stephanie Spellers, whom you mentioned, is also really important. And I'll just flag for everyone, she has a book that became really important to me about, I would say, almost 15 years ago now, called Radical Welcome. And if anyone who's a member of the cathedral or of an Episcopal church, or frankly any community, what Stephanie does that's brilliant is talk about the relationship between culture and evangelism.
Mhm.
That we're never just evangelizing individuals. So I'm
Right.
glad you mentioned both of them. You did say that some people who come from other traditions struggle, other church traditions struggle with what evangelism means because they've perhaps been burned by it, or there were different models in other churches. You yourself did not grow up in the Episcopal Church. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became an Episcopalian?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I did not grow up an Episcopalian. In fact, my father, my grandfather, most of my uncles, great uncles were all Southern Baptist ministers. in Evangelist, actually. I had one uncle that was like a stadium filling Billy Graham-esque, right? Like I always say he was on the Billy Graham circuit.
Really?
Evangelist. Yeah, yeah, yes. Yes, I have like in fact, my whole going to where I went to college was negotiated on the stage at a Billy Graham revival. My my grandfather was sitting next to the president of a university here in Arkansas, and anyway, it's a whole thing. So I really grew up right in the center of the Southern Baptist world, and that's how I grew up. But my father, who was a minister, was a little bit of a little bit of a rebel and did his own thing. We didn't stay in the South. We actually ended up we lived all over the country, and when I was about 12, we moved to Juneau, Alaska, and he became the pastor of First Baptist Church, Juneau, Alaska. And the thing that's interesting about Alaska that's different in particular from the South, now it's not different from the whole country because I think this is true of a lot of parts of the country. But in the South, if you've ever been to the South, there are churches literally on every corner, it seems like. And sometimes you'll have like you'll be at an intersection and you will see it's just church intersection, right? There's so
Oh,
many,
absolutely. I mean,
right? Right.
there are Christians everywhere in the South.
Right. I mean, it's just assumed that you're Christian in the South. I mean, it's just assumed that you have some sort of church affiliation,
Right.
even if you don't attend, right? Like there's something there. Well, Juneau is totally different culture. Just that's not the assumption at all. I mean,
Right.
in fact, it's the opposite. And so because of that, people don't necessarily, or at least they didn't in the 80s and the 90s when I was there, you didn't necessarily join a church because of your denominational affiliation. Maybe you did, but most people, because there's so fewer churches and it's more just a different culture, most people just joined the church that they liked, right? And brought their tradition with them to that church. And because of that, so and again, my dad being kind of open and free thinking in a lot of ways, there were people in that church in Juneau who had grown up Lutheran, Catholic, Methodist, probably Episcopalian, and who wanted to do some of the things from their traditions. And so one of the things that was already established, I think, when we got there, was that they every year around Christmas they made Advent wreaths, and there was like this Christmas fair kind of thing, and one of the activities that you could do was make Advent wreaths. Well, I'd never heard of an Advent wreath. I mean, now they're pretty common across denominations. They've
Sure.
become, Pinterest and Instagram have made them very widely accepted. But at that time, that was very unusual, and I was really drawn to that practice. And so I really think one of the seeds planted for my liturgical love affair was planted with those Advent wreaths because I love the sense of ritual. And I am just the kind of person who loves, I mean, Tina Clark knows me very well. And she would tell you, like, I love Martha Stewart. I love, any kind of festive thing. And so it was a beautiful way of kind of matching that love, this liturgical thing with my faith. And I just thought that was really cool. So fast forward a few years, I go to college. Your world cracks open a little bit wider in college, and you meet different people and different things. And I ended up being part of a non-denominational church at that point that again was kind of a melting pot for people that had come from different traditions. And I was on staff at that church right after college, and again, people were asking things like, hey, we used to do this thing called Maundy Thursday, or we used to do this thing called Lent, or right, like these different, and the pastor who was my uncle and the staff were like, sure, let's do it. That sounds really cool. Like those sound like beautiful things to do. And so I began to discover more and more and more these different liturgical expressions of faith and the ways that you could really mark the significance of a day through tactile expressions, candles and rituals and smells and the thing, all these different beautiful art, all these different things.
Right.
And then I had kids. So all that was happening. I was discovering more liturgical things. And then I had kids, and I wanted to be able to do these sorts of liturgical things at home with them, right? Like I was like, I want to do Advent wreaths with my own kids. I want to do different things. Basically, I was like, I want to do Martha Stewart for Jesus at home, where can I find this? And so I started just researching and looking for different resources around these different things. And that's how I actually discovered the actual liturgical calendar. And I discovered Phyllis Tickle, the author, and actually, I before I discovered all her work around the emergent church, I discovered some of her more domestic writings, which really had to
Mm.
do with living a liturgical year at home, like with her family. And long story short, it led me down the path, and I had a blog, and I had these kids, and I was doing these things, and I became friends with Phyllis Tickle, and she told me that I should write a book about this. So I wrote a book called A Homemade Year, which is all about living a liturgical year at home. And when I got, and by this point, we were in an emergent church, but then we left that church because that church, it was fine. It was, nothing was wrong, but they weren't going in a liturgical direction. And I absolutely knew that I was being called in a liturgical direction. You know, I was writing a whole book about it, and for Pete's sake. And so I got done writing that book, and about the time I turned the manuscript in, it was coming up on Advent, and my husband and I were like, and I don't think actually we had been attending. We'd kind of taken a year off from actually going to church while I finished the book. Oh, the irony. But it was Advent, and I said, we have to go to church. I just wrote a whole book about the liturgical calendar. We need to be in, and I need to be, our kids need to be, we need to be in a community, and it's Advent, it's the start of the year. Let's find a new church. And so we wanted to be a part of a church that was in our neighborhood, and there happened to be an Episcopal church in our neighborhood. And so we went because we also knew that we wanted to be a part of a church that ordained women, followed the liturgical calendar, and at that point would bless gay unions.
So
And
we sort of see where this is headed, Jerusalem.
yeah, because in Arkansas, where else are you going to go, right? Like where else are you going to go if those are your requirements? So we went to our local neighborhood Episcopal church. And it was Advent, and I heard the Psalms sung chanted for the first time.
Mhm.
I'd never heard that. And just tears, like just tears. And I knew we were home. Like I say I've always been Episcopalian. I just didn't know it, right? For the first 35 years of my life. Um, but something about hearing those Psalms sung and chanted, I understood them in a new way that I had never. It's like I finally heard them as they were meant to be communicated.
Right.
And I just bawled, and that
Mm.
was it. That was the moment.
Well,
So,
that's really, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing such a personal story. That's also really interesting in the context of evangelism, because I would say that for a lot of Episcopalians, we tend to assume, especially when we're meeting with someone like you, like the staff officer for evangelism, that your cup of tea, the big push will be to use words to share the gospel of Jesus Christ and to get people to church, kind of so both an evangelism program and also a big church program. But the way you're talking about evangelism, it's so much more than that. I mean, you're sort of your big example was chanted psalms, which is
right.
not, I mean, in my experience, what we tend to associate with evangelism. So clearly, you have a very broad definition of evangelism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you sketch for us, in addition to those chanted psalms, some other ways, some other types, some other of evangelism, some other ways in which different personalities, say, may even do evangelism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I would just like to say is that what made those psalms meaningful to me is how authentic and they were, right? Like the people singing them and chanting them were doing so beautifully, and it was very authentic.
Mm,
And um and I think that's where we have to start. Wherever we are and however we're going to be called individually to evangelize, which again is just sharing good news, right? Like that's what it is. We have to, it has to be authentic. And so we can't, it's not going to look the same for everybody. There's not a one size fits all. Um, and which I think is good, which I actually think is also good news. So I think there's different ways. I think for some people, evangelism is simply going for a hike with a friend and, asking to say, well, what's going on in your life right now? And how do you connect with the divine, right? Like starting those conversations, or, I don't know if you believe in God, but what do you think about all this?
Mm.
Coming at it with curiosity, right? Instead of coming at it with, we have the answers, coming at opening the conversation in a way that says, what do you love? How does that give you meaning in your life? Tell me about that, right? Where do you find meaning? Um, so it can be as simple as going on a hike and having a conversation. For some people, it really is the action part. I mean, I think we do sometimes need to use our words. We obviously need to use our words a lot, but it's that showing up and just being loving, right? It's the serving in the soup kitchens. And even more than that, I think it's the personal thing. So it's the looking around at your neighborhood and going, especially right now, like during COVID, right? Like, who needs help with groceries, or who needs help with their kids schooling in some way? Is there something I can do safely from a distance? Can I just, sit and read with them, 6 feet apart in the backyard or whatever, so the mom can like breathe, or the dad can breathe? I think it begins in relationship. It just has to begin in relationship and authenticity. And that's how I think you find your way to sharing good news, because good news sounds different to different people.
Right.
And what one person needs to hear isn't necessarily what the other person needs to hear or experience, but you have to be in relationships with those people, to know that. One example that I just want to share is there was a church once, and this is a church-wide example and not an individual, but I think everybody here can extrapolate the personal from this. So they wanted to do something good. They had good motives. They wanted to do something helpful for the neighborhood school that was in close proximity to their church. So they decided that they were going to do a book program, and they were going to buy books for all the kids in the school. And they gathered the money, they bought the books, they took the books to the school. Well, that was great, except the school didn't actually need books. The school actually had a really high literacy program, and they were doing great. And what they needed was they needed school supplies or something. There was some other need, right? But the point is that the church had this great idea, but they didn't have a relationship with the school to know what the school actually needed and what the children actually needed. They just presumed to know. And, another part of our baptismal covenant is that we will honor the dignity of all people, right? Well, when we presume to know what's best for them, we're not honoring the dignity. And that even goes as far as when we presume that they don't want to hear about God or good news or what's bringing us alive, we're not giving them the chance, right? We're not honoring their individuality and their dignity to let them say to us, this is actually what I need, or
Yeah.
yes, I would like to. Anyway,
Now
so
that's wonderful. I think what really what I hear you saying is that our assumptions about evangelism, which are largely based upon Christian traditions other than the Episcopal Church,
right.
and to a degree are based upon what we've read or know about sending missionaries to other countries, like
Yes.
that take the gospel, so to speak, and take the church to
Mm-hmm.
some foreign land that doesn't know Jesus, and all those, often, just terrible stories from our history. They were terrible because they did exactly what you're counseling us not to do, which is make assumptions about what other people need.
Mm-hmm.
Don't listen because you have the truth and you have Jesus, and just import the gospel, so to speak.
Right.
So is that a piece of what you're trying to undo? Is sort of that that model for mission and evangelism? Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that's hugely fair. That's exactly what we're trying to undo. That it's not, for lack of a better word, we're not trying to colonize, right? We're not trying to go in and say, we have the only way, we know what's best for you. I mean, you just can't do that. that negates pretty much everything our baptismal covenant asks us to do. And so instead, we're trying to say what evangelism really is rooted in is in relationship. The current working, we say this is the working definition right now, is that Episcopal evangelism is when we seek, name, and celebrate the good news of Jesus, and then we invite everyone to more. And to break that down, what that means is we're just trying to see, where is God showing up? Where is God at work? That can look so many different ways. And then to name that, to begin to name it, because I think, we can all talk about our favorite restaurants or the movie we just saw, because we've had years of practice. I mean, we've practiced talking about food and movies and books since the time we were really little, right?
Sure.
But we haven't practiced talking about our faith because of all this negative stuff that's been put around it, I think. And because we don't want to do it badly, but we have to practice. We have to start somewhere. So the naming piece is just beginning to get comfortable saying, okay, that's where I saw God at work. Even if it was just, I saw someone help someone else in the parking lot of the grocery store. And that looks like God's love and mercy to me. And to text a friend and say, hey, you'll never believe what I just saw in the parking lot. Right. And then, and so I think we have to begin to kind of like look for where God is showing up, big and small, and then we begin to practice naming it. And then comes the celebrating it, which is really, the celebrating part is really about just being excited, just the same way you would be excited about the restaurant, right? Like, this is so great. I'm so excited about this. And then inviting people to more. And more can look like a lot of different things. More
Yes.
can look like coming to church. More can look like going on a hike. More can just be like, would you like me to pray for you?
Right.
Right? Not pray, just, would you like,
Right.
I see you're struggling. Would you like me to, I'm a person of faith. And if it would bring you comfort, I'd like to pray for you. Right? So that doesn't put anything on them.
Yeah.
But it lets them know that you are a person of faith. And if and when they have questions about that, you are someone that would be open they could come to.
No, I think this is lovely, and we've got a question that came in, but I'll get to it in just a moment. What I like about what you're doing. So we've been rightly critical of kind of the colonization model.
Right. Right.
So let's be critical of a different sort of type of church. I do think, and I've preached this. I've been an Episcopal priest for almost 20 years or 20 years. Preach the gospel when you have to, use the words. The St. Francis adage, that is so true. Desmond Tutu, good news for a hungry person is bread. The
Right.
whole notion of action, all of that's great and true, and you're not at all disagreeing with that.
Mm-mm.
But this bit about naming is really interesting, and it's something I think sometimes Episcopalians struggle with a little bit, because we're trying to be humble. We don't want to presume that we know God. We don't want to be like Billy Graham, whatever.
Right.
But this bit about naming is something that we really need to think more about, because it's about if we don't ever get to the naming, or as you put it, sort of the wondering about God,
Mm-hmm.
all of our good actions, and they are good, like we're a little too like they're just still a little bit about too much about us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like to me it would open it up a bit more if you're in conversation with someone, say about a feeding program or this awesome good work that you've been involved in, just wondering, God, what would it be like if God is like this ad infinitum? What if heaven is an abundance of food and there's never any more hunger? Is that kind of what you're also suggesting we do? Is that wondering? Is that a form of naming?
Absolutely. I think wondering is a huge part of naming. Yeah, I think the question could also be, did I see God? Right? Like, was that God? Was that God's
Yeah.
love? Yeah, I think anytime we're curious, it just opens everything up. It opens our imagination up, right?
Mhm.
It's certainty. And that's what's so interesting is this whole notion that following Jesus has to be about certainty, when really I think it's about curiosity. Jesus was infinitely curious, right? And kind of always like, what are you doing today? What's going on, right? And I don't think we're called to have the answers, but I think we are open. We are called to be open to what God is doing and then to acknowledge and join what God is doing. And I think that's where we have to, and I think that's what's different about us from, say, the Rotary Club, right? The Rotary Club does wonderful things. What makes our backpack program different than the Rotary Club's backpack program? And that's, I think, where the naming part becomes really important, because we say it's a spiritual practice, that evangelism is a spiritual practice. And I think that's true. I think it's a muscle that we have to continue to stretch and build, and that we are changed by it as much as whomever we encounter. That our faith grows the more you can name something, right? And the more you see it, the more you become aware of it. It's like when you buy a car and then suddenly you see that car everywhere, right? You know how you've never seen this car, and then suddenly you buy that car, and then suddenly, like, I have a Honda Pilot, now I see white Honda Pilots everywhere, And so I think it's the same. Once we own it, we own our faith, and we begin to look for where it's at, I think the world just cracks open,
Mm.
with the glory of God at work. And I think it changes us. And I think as we are changed, the world around us is changed. So, yeah.
The question that came in is from Jenny Creasy, a very active parishioner here at the cathedral. Another type of evangelism at St. John's is through arts and education. Concert series pre-COVID, like Mile High Theology with Greer, whom you know, which is a podcast, Evensong, architectural tours. Do you, Jerusalem, have additional thoughts regarding the arts as a form of evangelism?
Oh, yeah. I think the arts are a huge form of evangelism. I think the thing that I would say about anything we do, and this is something I even push for in my office and at the Episcopal Church Center, is, are we just putting something out that someone's going to consume? Or are we also providing formation and connection through this thing? So, for instance, okay, let's say we're back to normal and we have a gallery show, right? Or I can give you an example that we did. So we did one year for Ash Wednesday. There's a traveling art show that you can get that's all about tattoos. And there are these beautiful photographs of people's tattoos. And then there is a story that goes next to them about how that tattoo is a reflection of a faith, something faith-based in their life, right? And so it's this beautiful show. Now you can just put that show up and open the doors and let people come in and look. That's fine. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that is kind of, I would say that leans more towards the consumer side of things, right? Or you can do that and have that open so that people who are just that's where they're at, they just want to come in and look and see, and they're not ready to go any deeper. That's fine. They have that opportunity, and God can work in that. But then we also had a couple of nights where we had local people come and share their tattoos and their faith stories in person, and then had conversations around that, right? So then the people who came also then shared their stories. So we'd have kind of the official speaker, but then a lot of the people who attended also had tattoos. And we opened up the whole conversation to marks of faith on our body, how our bodies carry the marks of
Fascinating.
faith, right? And so it allowed people to even go that much deeper. And so I think art is a great way to have that initial draw. And sometimes that's all someone's ready for. Sometimes all they're ready for is to walk around a gallery and contemplate that maybe, this has a faith base. But then there's other people that are ready to go a little bit deeper and to begin to build that relationship. So I think as long as we're offering those various steps and stages of interaction, then absolutely it's evangelistic. But I think if we get too just consumer based, of where people are just looking and they're not participating, maybe it's on the edge.
Well, I, I think that's really interesting. And, Jenny's good question. And then your example, I think about here at the cathedral. So Jenny gave the example of evensong, which would be comparable to you. Well, it is not comparable. It's identical to your example of chanted psalms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically an artistic, musical, and architectural experience of the Psalms, and by extension, our humanity.
Yeah.
Then something like Mile High Theology, I think about Broderick hosted last year. Bobby Lefebvre is the Colorado Poet Laureate. And Broderick hosted Mr. Lefebvre reading poems, and it was a Q&A in the church, in the cathedral.
Yeah.
And Lefebvre wrestles with religion, but is not. He's outside of the walls of the church, but wrestles with deep religious themes. And the conversation, even though it was not evangelism per se, and it was not at all evensong, and felt nothing like evensong, it did feel like an exploration of themes like truth and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And that felt very spiritual and implicitly connecting us even with Christ, so to speak. And that to me is comparable to what you're saying about the tattoo artistic storytelling.
Right.
So I just highlight that. I think you do a good job, Jerusalem, of there are different models that do very different things. And we need all of them, and models that we can't even imagine. And that gets back to your point about authenticity, correct?
Right. Correct. Yes. Yes. We need all the different ways and all the different points of interaction, and to be offering those. I think it gets smaller and smaller, right? Like you may have 100 people come to the tattoo exhibit, and then you might have 50 people come to the lecture. And then out of that, you might get 10 people who want to continue to meet in a small group to read a book about something, right? And so, but to be willing and prepared to offer those different intersections, I think is really how we can take art and service, especially again, like the food pantry and the art exam, anything that starts with action, and not words. I think being prepared to have different entry points of people going deeper, I think is really important in how we move from just creating the "if we build it, they will come" models.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, it's great. I mean, I love going to a concert. Sometimes I wish I could talk about what I experienced in that concert deeper with a group of people intentionally.
Yeah.
So,
All right,
yeah.
let's look for a moment. I was thinking about Jesus in the Gospels. And I'm curious if you think Jesus is actually good at evangelism, because, we so associate evangelism like sharing Jesus, but let's
Right.
see if actually Jesus is good at this, or more seriously provides a kind of model for the things you're suggesting. And what I found myself thinking about is the different conversations that Jesus had with people
Mm-hmm.
in the Gospels, and also how that conversation ended, and what Jesus did or didn't tell a person to go and do.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about one, when Jesus is in conversation with the blind person. Jesus says, and I find this to be one of the most evocative moments in the Gospels. I mean, it just almost can bring me to tears sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says to the person, "What do you want me to do for you?"
Mm-hmm.
And then I imagine this incredible pause before the man says, "I want to see again." I think about the weird story about the Gerasene demoniac, which I'm sure you remember. and this guy that's healed from these demons that are cast out from him. Jesus sends the demons into the herd of swine. God bless your Winston. I mean, it would be like Winston getting a demon and jumping off a cliff up there in the Ozarks. And what Jesus does, Jesus doesn't say, now go to the temple, go to the synagogue. It seems that Jesus restores him to health of mind and perhaps to community. I think about Jesus just simply being with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus in their home. And it's very, enjoying meals and company and conversation and prayer. It's not dramatic. And the scale is tiny. It's 3 people, 4 people. So oh gosh, the parables. I mean, Jesus would just be, I didn't anticipate us talking about Billy Graham so much, but I don't imagine Billy Graham is not a parabolist. Billy Graham doesn't tell parables. I mean, Jesus would not get passing marks in terms of that style of evangelism. He tells these strange stories that apparently don't have a one singular point. Right. So was Jesus good at this?
Oh, Jesus is horrible at it. By our standards, right? Like by the typical, what has become like the evangelism standard. I mean, yeah, you're right. He spoke in parables. He was cranky quite a lot.
Yeah.
Like he was always annoyed. He was trying to get away from people half the time. He was either,
oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like he's either trying to get away from them or he's inviting himself over, right? Which, I mean, he's either like to Zacchaeus, like, dude, I'm coming to your house. You might want to get down and go sweep the floor because I'm coming over. Or he's like trying to get in a boat and leave, always trying to get away. No, Jesus is like an ad guy's nightmare, right? Like he does not stay on the talking points. He's not affable in any way. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about Jesus is that we talk so much about the love of Jesus. And I'm like, love of Jesus is kind of cranky. And it's interesting, right? It's not always this touchy-feely business, but what Jesus was, I think, was authentic to who he was created to be. I mean, if we believe that Jesus was fully human, then that means he had a personality, right? And he had quirks and he had proclivities. He had things he loved and things that annoyed him. And he was always sending people back home. He was, except with the exception of the disciples, everyone he healed, he was like, go home, go home, go home.
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to, again, that authenticity piece and that go be among your community. I mean, his community was the disciples. It was Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, obviously, but go build those relationships, go home and be a part of your community and be good news in your community. And that's the thing. But yeah, no, Jesus, I can remember when I got this job, one of my interview questions was, how do you feel about Jesus or what's your relationship with Jesus? Which you're probably all glad to know. They ask that when they're hiring for the Episcopal Church, right? And I was like, it's complicated because he's very cranky. And he doesn't always inspire, like I'm frustrated quite a bit with how he spoke and how he has left us all to argue about different things in a lot of ways, right? But I also really believe that it is the way to a whole life. And if I really believe it, if we really believe what he taught is true, then we got to do it. And I think that's where Jesus leaves us, is that is with us in this idea that we are who we are, and that we have to build relationships and communities, and there's no easy button, right? There's no easy button to the Christian life, and that includes evangelism. It's going to be a little bit messy and irregular and not always fit into like a branded image on Instagram, right? Like, again, ad guy's nightmare, like,
That's a great line. Before we break, Jerusalem, and we've only got a minute or two more, for somebody who might be thinking, hey, Jerusalem, give me advice on just practically what to do, different ways of doing this that are very practical and concrete. What would you suggest?
Yeah. So, one of the things I would do, I would invite everyone to do is this personal experiment, which is to like maybe when you get off this call or get done with church today, um, sit down and just get a piece of paper and write down these three things. Write down seek, name, celebrate. And then under seek, I would like you to just to write down a little pivotal moment in your life, good or bad, doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? Like got a new job, got divorced, had a baby, moved across the country, whatever. And then write down under the name part, who are the people who helped you in that way? Either they
Mhm.
let you whine, right? You just needed to complain and they let you do that, or maybe they packed boxes for you, or however they showed up. And then under the celebrate part, like write down all the attributes of God that that person showed or those people showed. So were they patient? Were they merciful? Were they long suffering because they listened to you whine? Were they gentle? Maybe did they rebuke you, but within love, right? They're like, get your act together. What are all the attributes of God? And then that is the beginning of understanding that a lot of times with evangelism, people are like, I don't have God stories. I don't know how to see where God's at work. That little method you can use every day of your life. Like you can sit at the end of your day and go, what was a moment in my day that went well or went poorly, right? Like who showed up for me in that moment or what happened and how was that God? And when you begin to think that way and see the world that way, it becomes easier and easier to talk about it that way. And then tell one of those stories like on Facebook, right? Like share
Yes.
one of those stories on social media. It's a good low impact way to begin to practice.
Oh, that is just absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Well, Jerusalem, this has been really, really interesting. One last question for you. I have no idea what your email inbox is like, but if someone who's following today has an evangelism success story, or maybe an evangelism failure and just needs some advice,
Okay.
do you like getting emails from us out in the field
I
about?
love it.
Oh, do you?
Yes.
Good, good.
Yes, I love it. Yes. I work for y'all. I mean, I like to say that, like, I may be on the presiding bishop's staff, right? But the way our economy works in the Episcopal Church is that, the church gives to the diocese gives to the church center. I work for y'all. I mean, so I am here for you and whatever that means.
That is
Answering questions.
absolutely wonderful. So we'll have about 100 people on this. Do you mind sharing your email address?
No, I don't know. It's super easy. Y'all can put it in the chat. It's jgreer@episcopalchurch.org.
jgreer@episcopalchurch.org. Jerusalem, thank you so much. I hope our paths cross again. God bless you in Arkansas, and thank you so much for taking such good care of this Episcopal Church that we love and encouraging us to get the good word out in word and deed and being really curious about God and other people's lives. That's absolutely lovely, and I'm grateful for it.
Thanks for having me. It's been lovely.
As we break, just a friendly reminder to everyone who is watching, all of our Dean's Forum are made possible because of pledges and financial gifts. So if you're prayerfully considering giving a financial pledge to the Cathedral for 2021, we would be grateful and we need it. And we promise to be a good steward of it. And you can pledge online at sjcathedral.org/pledge, or simply go to the homepage and click give, and you'll find the option. Last but certainly not least, in about 11 minutes, our weekly service of Holy Eucharist with spiritual communion will be launched also from our homepage, sjcathedral.org. And for those who are comfortable, in-person communion in the cathedral between noon and 2 p.m. We would love to see you. God bless all of you.